TDoS attacks, telephony denial of service attacks. TDoS attacks are a little bit of a different story than a DDoS attack. In a TDoS attack, it's just a bunch of phone calls, right? Again, it's a resource depletion attack. You're throwing a lot of phone calls from whatever source at the target, and you're going to overload something. And it's just a question of what do you overload first? Do you overload the call taker? Do you overload the backend system for call handling? Do you overload the call routing system? Do you overload the wires between call routing and you, or the tandems between the originating service provider and the call routing system? Or do you overload like different things in different places all at once, which is probably what's going to happen depending. So TDoS attacks are very real. TDoS attacks against 911 are very uncommon. TDoS attacks against admin lines, pretty common. So against the 911, you can't really call 911 long distance. Right now, this is being filmed in New York City. I decide I want to dial 911 in San Diego. That's really difficult, right? I mean, no. If I dial 911, I go to my local jurisdiction, whoever the local jurisdiction is. But if you're dealing with an admin line is a DID, a direct in-dial line. In other words, it's a normal 10-digit phone number, right? So a normal 10-digit phone number, I can dial long distance. Well, that's great. So if I was in, say, Gaza, not chosen at random, and I decided to dial 20 admin lines for 20 different PSAPs, conference them all together, and say, please stand by for important announcement. Click. You're going to waste time. You're going to waste a lot of time as everybody tries to figure out, like, okay, who called this? Why are we here? What's going on? And I can dial that from anywhere. It gets worse. I can dial that repeatedly, rapidly, right? I could compromise a computer, have that computer use a SIP system so that it could auto dial very quickly, maybe a couple thousand a second, and I could smash your admin lines. Small and medium PSAPs frequently will configure their admin lines to roll over to their 911 lines because they have staffing issues, right? I mean, you can never have enough staffing. Staffing's difficult in a PSAP. So the admin lines a lot of times come in and hit dispatchers, where obviously once they've rolled over to 911, they would hit normal call takers. Well, the dispatchers would prefer not to ignore an admin line, but at least that call's been handled by somebody. Somebody, calling an admin line, or dispatchers calling other dispatchers, PSAPs calling other PSAPs, it's an administrative function. At least the caller coming in, the public caller coming in has been addressed by somebody. They've gotten some help. With this rollover function, where you roll over the admin lines to the 911, you've now allowed 911 to be called long distance, because that's what you've done. And so now, if I wanted to, I can take my laptop and pull it out and pull up my dialing program, and I can smack somebody that's across the country with a few thousand 911 calls. Not good. And what are they going to do about it? Not good. And these can either just be straight phone calls just to jam up their lines. These could be phone calls with 30 seconds of recorded screaming, phone calls with, some kind of an AVR of, that we've all had robocalls. And there are things that in theory will help protect against this. StirShaken is out now. StirShaken is somewhat helpful in that StirShaken validates whether or not the person that's making the call has the authority to use that phone number and et cetera. But 911 systems accept calls from anybody. That's the point of a 911 system. So there's a real open question about how effective StirShaken will be in protecting 911 systems. The number one protection is simply reconfiguring your 911 system, your call taking system, so that when calls come into an admin line, if they overflow and you feel the need to push them to a 911, they go into a specific queue, like a specific overflow queue that can be deprioritized versus the public queue. So that then if you get the saturation effect, okay, it can only go so far. It can only be so bad. That is extremely helpful. The real question going forward is, what if you get large scale attacks? So we've seen this in a limited way. Most of the large scale attacks we've seen so far, most of them have been unintentional, usually equipment malfunction. So the best example is a town in the south of the US had a flood. And when they flooded, an elevator decided to call 911 5,000 times. Great. So the elevator is calling 911 and cheerfully reporting that the elevator is calling 911 and cheerfully reporting that the elevator is calling 911. And you can imagine at some point, I can envision the call takers like, oh God, it's the elevator again. But you've got to handle the calls, right? So under the current structure, there are options. Okay, one of the problems with this volume of calls, and it could easily have been 50,000 calls or 100,000 calls, right? This doesn't end. What if 2 elevators had done it? Most buildings have more than 1 elevator, right? You can see where this goes. And this isn't even bad intent. This is just an equipment short circuit. So first things first, this comes in over whatever your tandem to the originating service provider, phone company, to you. How many lines is that? Are they all jammed up with elevator calls? Right? So you could get drop calls. Public's calling in, not able to reach you. That's not good. Hits the router. How many calls can the router process? Generally, the router's fine. Right? This is kind of the replacement for the old IPSRs, the old IP selective routers. Generally, next-gen routers can handle this volume, no problem. But conceptually, maybe not, right? It's something to be very aware of. So then from the router down to the PSAP, can the network handle this volume of calls? Unknown, right? Got to have that traffic study. Make sure when that router's put in, you looked at that traffic study and make sure that that's a good place. And then, of course, you hit the PSAP backend system on the call handling. Can it address it? Maybe not. And then you get down to queue structure and everything else. And ultimately, the call takers can't take 5,000 elevator calls, right? I mean, it breaks down. So TDoSs are a concern. They're a real concern. We see them so far mostly in either equipment error, accident, coding error. We've seen that where, in error or in intentional act, somebody coded a system so that when you did X, Y, and Z, it called 911. And you didn't ask it to call 911. It's just you did your status update and you did this, and then you retweeted something and it called 911. Enjoy. Not good. Going forward, the real fear is that when you get into nation state level attacks, you could get intentional misuse of the 911 system using a TDoS to destroy its functionality. There's some real fear around that, and it's well-founded. So it's really a question of how do you structure the systems? How do you structure the tandems? How do you do your traffic capacity and your traffic study? How do you make sure that the routing system is robust enough to handle it, and if necessary in a failure mode, still robust enough to handle it? And then how do you communicate what is called a call confidence level between call handling and the call router so that call handling can say, look, it's the elevator. Stop sending me this call. Like, I know this is bogus. I have a very high confidence that this is junk. And so router, get rid of this call for me. I never want to see it again. I don't want it to hit my queue. I don't want it to hit my system. I don't want it to hit my operators. Just dump it or deliver it to a specific queue, the elevator queue, so that somebody can go in and randomly sample it or whatever, but we know it's bogus. That's dangerous. Because you're now talking about intentionally destroying a 911 call. And there are legal questions. The PSAP operator has broad latitude to service 911 calls as they see fit. Right? There's no legal restrictions, or most places there are no legal restrictions on that. They do the best they can. But call routing is an FCC regulated function, and the FCC has deemed, with good reason, that all 911 calls should be delivered. Well, if all 911 calls have to be delivered, it's not within the router operator's purview to decide that that elevator is not a 911 call. It is a 911 call. It's just one that we know is an error. So in that case, there's an open question. Can the router destroy that call? At a minimum, the router can route that call differentially and route it to a specific queue. We'll call it the elevator queue, which is a low confidence queue, which is simply a best effort queue. Right? So the call takers take all of the normal calls coming in, and then as they're available, they take these other calls. That's sort of the medium answer we have for right now. There is one change, though, within the way that Motorola is addressing this, the way that Vesta under Motorola is addressing this, which is how do we want to handle this at the router level? So it is possible to run destruction level TDoS attacks. We've never seen them in the wild, but it's possible. There have been research papers written on this, and this will work. This will happen at some point, where you compromise 5,000, 10,000 cell phones, Androids most likely, but not unnecessarily, and you do what's called a persistent anonymous attack. So as an example, You compromise a cell phone through a nice picture of a kitten on a Roomba or however you get in. Once you've compromised the phone, you run a little bit of code that does the following. You turn off the bezel so that nobody sees what you're about to do. You disconnect the SIM card. You generate your own IMEI, which is like a MAC address for a phone. You associate with the local cell phone tower as a non-service phone. You dial 911. You play 30 seconds of noise, whatever that noise is. You hang up the call. You reconnect the SIM card. You turn the bezel back on. Okay. So what happens? What did I just do? I just disconnected your phone. I removed you from whatever your network provider is, and I made 911 calls non-service phone. And then I turned your phone back to normal operations. You don't know anything happened. You never saw anything. And of course, you put a bit of code in there so that if you touch the bezel, it just aborts all of this and your phone works normally. Isn't that great? You may have a minute of like, hey, my phone seems a little, oh, okay, there it is. 911 center takes a phone call from a non-service phone. There are a lot of non-service phones out there, especially in domestic abuse cases, where you have control of the finances and that sort of thing. So these phone calls must be delivered per FCC rule, and should be delivered. There's a good moral argument for it. That call comes through as a non-service call. I can't call it back. I can't find where that caller is. The caller doesn't know they made the call. I can't take an action on it. Okay, what do I do with it? Well, I handle it, and then I write an exception report or incident report or whatever that basically says, somebody called, played a recording, hang up. Well, if I've compromised 10,000 phones and I have each phone do that a couple of times an hour, your PSAP's overwhelmed. It doesn't matter where you are, your PSAP's overwhelmed. I mean, you can't handle that. And if you could handle it, I would just compromise more phones. So how do you address this? And so this is kind of the latest thing that is really being addressed. And there are lots of answers which work and have too high a price to really be used, right? Well, we're not going to accept non-service calls. But there are legitimate users of non-service calls that need this function. Well, we're going to start blacklisting numbers and dropping phone calls and destroying this traffic. Okay, how do you know you're not destroying legitimate traffic? Right? I mean, this becomes a very difficult thing, but the overwhelming concept that has to be remembered is if you don't take an action, if we as an industry don't take an action, you're allowing the attacker to decide what traffic to destroy. Because the attacker's just taking you out. They'll take the router out at this point. They'll take a region out. And if you don't stop that, you've allowed them to make those decisions. So the law is tricky in this area because you have to deliver the calls, but this is kind of the current state of play in TDoS. And the Vesta answer for this is pretty direct. We're installing systems that allow us to, in real time, analyze the data going through, analyze the calls going through, look for patterns, and then make traffic shaping decisions. Whether that traffic gets redirected to specific queues that have a low confidence assigned, or working with the PSAP, whether that traffic actually gets nullified.